Nelson Mandela was born on July 18, 1918, in the small village of Mvizo, located in the eastern Cape of South Africa. He was given the name relentless, a Xhosa term that roughly translates to pulling the branch of a tree, or colloquially, troublemaker. Mandela's father, Gadla Henry Mfakani-Iswa, was a local chief and counselor to the Thembu royal family, providing young Mandela with an early understanding of leadership and governance. Tragically, Mandela's father passed away when he was just 9 years old, leading to a significant shift in his upbringing. He was sent to live with Chief Janjantaba Dalindibo, the acting regent of the Thembu people, who became a guardian and mentor to Mandela. Under Janjantaba's care, Mandela was exposed to the customs, traditions, and responsibilities of leadership. These formative years played a crucial role in shaping Mandela's character and sowing the seeds of his future activism. Mandela attended local mission schools, where he was introduced to Western education and the values of Christianity, which deeply influenced his early worldview. It was during his schooling at the Clarkberry Boarding Institute that a teacher gave him the name Nelson, following the common practice of assigning Christian names to African children. Mandela later pursued higher education at the University of Fort Hare, the first institution of higher learning for Black Africans in South Africa. At Fort Hare, Mandela began to display a sense of justice and resistance against inequality. He was elected to the Student Council, but was suspended for participating in a boycott against university policies he and others considered unfair. This marked one of Mandela's earliest acts of defiance against authority, showcasing his emerging leadership qualities. In 1941, Mandela fled to Johannesburg to escape an arranged marriage and began working various jobs, including as a night watchman and a law clerk. His time in the bustling city exposed him to the harsh realities of racial segregation and injustice faced by Black South Africans daily. It was here that Mandela's political awakening began, and he started to immerse himself in the fight for equality, setting the stage for his lifelong struggle against apartheid. Nelson Mandela's journey into education began in mission schools, where he was first introduced to formal learning. These schools, run by Christian missionaries, were among the few avenues available to Black South Africans at the time. Despite the limitations imposed by the apartheid regime, Mandela excelled in his studies and developed a deep appreciation for knowledge. His early schooling laid a foundation that would later shape his understanding of justice and leadership. After completing his primary education, Mandela attended the prestigious Clarkberry Boarding Institute, where he received a more advanced education. It was here that he first encountered students from diverse backgrounds, which broadened his perspective and furthered his belief in the importance of equality. Mandela's academic journey continued at Healdtown, a Methodist college that emphasized discipline, integrity, and hard work, values that would remain central to his life. In 1939, Mandela enrolled at the University of Fort Hare, the premier institution for higher education among Black South Africans. Fort Hare was a vibrant intellectual hub, fostering critical thinking and political discourse. While studying law and arts, Mandela became actively involved in student politics, advocating for fair treatment and opposing oppressive university policies. His participation in a boycott of the Student Council elections led to his suspension, marking one of his first acts of resistance against injustice. Determined to complete his education, Mandela later pursued law studies through correspondence at the University of South Africa and subsequently enrolled at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. At Witwatersrand, he was one of the few Black students, and his experiences of racism and exclusion solidified his commitment to fighting systemic inequality. As Mandela immersed himself in his studies, he was drawn to the works of political thinkers and activists who championed justice and human rights. He read extensively about African history, Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolent resistance, and Marxist theories of class struggle. These intellectual pursuits helped him to articulate a vision for a South Africa free from oppression. His education became a powerful tool in his activism, equipping him with the skills to challenge apartheid laws and defend those who were marginalized by the system. Through education, Mandela not only gained knowledge but also developed a profound awareness of the structural injustices entrenched in South African society. His academic journey was more than a personal pursuit. It became the cornerstone of his fight for liberation, enabling him to rise as a legal and political leader in the struggle against apartheid. Nelson Mandela's involvement in anti-apartheid activism began in the 1940s, a time when racial segregation in South Africa was becoming increasingly institutionalized under apartheid. After moving to Johannesburg, Mandela encountered firsthand the brutality of racial discrimination. He worked as a law clerk while studying and began associating with political thinkers and activists who were deeply critical of the apartheid system. These experiences ignited Mandela's passion for justice and equality, laying the groundwork for his lifelong struggle against oppression. In 1944, Mandela joined the African National Congress, ANC, an organization dedicated to fighting for the rights of Black South Africans. Alongside Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, and other activists, he co-founded the ANC Youth League. The Youth League sought to inject energy and radicalism into the ANC, advocating for direct action and mass mobilization to challenge the apartheid government. Mandela quickly rose as a leader, known for his powerful oratory skills, strategic thinking, and unwavering commitment to the cause. By the 1950s, Mandela was at the forefront of several resistance campaigns, including the Defiance Campaign of 1952. This nonviolent protest involved acts of civil disobedience, such as refusing to comply with apartheid laws, which mobilized thousands of South Africans across racial lines. Mandela traveled extensively during this period, organizing grassroots movements and inspiring people to unite against injustice. His role in these protests earned him national recognition and established him as a key figure in the anti-apartheid struggle. Mandela also played a pivotal role in drafting the Freedom Charter in 1955, a revolutionary document that outlined a vision for a democratic, non-racial South Africa. The charter called for equal rights, universal suffrage, and land redistribution, among other principles. Its adoption marked a turning point in the liberation movement, solidifying the ANC's commitment to building a just and inclusive society. However, Mandela's activism came at great personal cost. He was repeatedly arrested, banned from public gatherings, and subjected to constant surveillance by the apartheid government. Despite these challenges, Mandela's resolve only grew stronger. Recognizing the limitations of nonviolent resistance in the face of increasing state violence, he helped establish Umkhonto we Sizwe, Spear of the Nation, the armed wing of the ANC, in 1961. This decision signaled a strategic shift in the liberation struggle, as Mandela and his comrades sought to intensify their fight against apartheid. Mandela's anti-apartheid activism was characterized by his courage, strategic brilliance, and deep empathy for those who suffered under the oppressive regime. Through his leadership, he united people from diverse backgrounds, fostering a sense of hope and determination in the face of immense adversity. His efforts laid the foundation for a sustained resistance movement that would eventually lead to the dismantling of apartheid. Nelson Mandela's imprisonment is one of the most defining chapters of his life, symbolizing resilience and the fight for justice. In 1962, Mandela was arrested and convicted of leaving the country without a passport and inciting workers to strike. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but this was only the beginning of his long incarceration. In 1964, during the Rivonia Trial, Mandela and his co-accused faced charges of sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the government. Mandela's powerful speech during the trial, where he declared his willingness to die for the ideal of a free and democratic society, became a historic moment in the anti-apartheid movement. Mandela was sentenced to life imprisonment and sent to Robben Island, a maximum security prison off the coast of Cape Town. The conditions on Robben Island were harsh. Prisoners were confined to small cells, subjected to hard labor, and deprived of basic amenities. Mandela's daily life involved breaking rocks in a lime quarry under the scorching sun, with minimal food and no access to outside news. Despite these conditions, Mandela maintained his dignity and used his time in prison to educate himself and his fellow inmates. While imprisoned, Mandela became a unifying figure among the inmates, fostering solidarity across racial and political lines. He encouraged debates, organized educational programs, and mentored younger activists. Mandela's leadership within the prison walls mirrored his role in the broader anti-apartheid struggle, as he continued to inspire hope and resistance even in captivity. The apartheid government attempted to isolate Mandela, but his influence extended far beyond the prison. His image as a freedom fighter grew internationally, with campaigns for his release gaining momentum around the world. Activists, organizations, and governments called for an end to apartheid, making Mandela a global symbol of the struggle for human rights. Despite numerous offers from the South African government to release him in exchange for renouncing violence, Mandela steadfastly refused to compromise his principles. Mandela spent 18 years on Robben Island before being transferred to Pollsmoor Prison in 1982 and later to Victor Verster Prison. Even as his physical confinement continued, Mandela maintained communication with the ANC and played a key role in shaping the organization's strategies from behind bars. His unwavering resolve during 27 years of imprisonment exemplified his dedication to the cause of freedom, earning him worldwide admiration and respect. The release of Nelson Mandela from prison on February 11, 1990, marked a watershed moment in South African and global history. After 27 years of incarceration, Mandela walked out of Victor Verster Prison, hand in hand with his wife Winnie, to the cheers of millions. His release was broadcast worldwide, symbolizing a new era of hope and the beginning of the end for apartheid. Despite spending nearly 3 decades behind bars, Mandela emerged with his principles, dignity, and vision intact. Mandela's release came after years of intense negotiations between the African National Congress, ANC, and the apartheid government. The South African state, under President F.W. de Klerk, had come under increasing pressure from internal resistance and international sanctions. By the late 1980s, it became clear that apartheid was no longer sustainable, prompting the government to engage with Mandela as a key figure in the liberation movement. Mandela played a pivotal role in these discussions, demonstrating both strategic brilliance and a willingness to compromise without abandoning the core ideals of equality and justice. Rather than seeking retribution for his years of suffering, Mandela used his newfound freedom to promote reconciliation and unity. He recognized that South Africa, deeply divided along racial and political lines, could only move forward through dialogue and cooperation. Mandela became a mediator, bringing together disparate groups, Afrikaners, Black South Africans, and others, to envision a future built on mutual respect and equality. Mandela's message of reconciliation was not just rhetoric. It was an active strategy. He urged his fellow ANC members and supporters to avoid revenge and instead focus on building a democratic society. Mandela publicly forgave his former oppressors, setting an example for the entire nation. He famously visited the widow of Hendrik Verwoerd, the architect of apartheid, and reached out to white South African leaders to build bridges of understanding. Under Mandela's leadership, South Africa underwent a dramatic transformation. In 1991, the apartheid laws were repealed, paving the way for the country's first multiracial elections. Mandela worked tirelessly to ensure that this transition was peaceful, even in the face of provocation and violence from factions that opposed change. His ability to inspire trust and confidence among both his allies and adversaries was instrumental in steering South Africa away from the brink of civil war. Mandela's release and subsequent advocacy for reconciliation showcased his belief in the power of forgiveness and unity. He understood that healing the wounds of the past required courage, humility, and the willingness to put the greater good above personal grievances. Mandela's commitment to reconciliation became a cornerstone of his leadership, shaping the legacy of a man who transformed a nation. Nelson Mandela's election as South Africa's first black president in 1994 marked a historic turning point for the nation and the culmination of decades of struggle against apartheid. His presidency came as a result of the country's first fully democratic elections, in which people of all races were allowed to vote. The African National Congress, ANC, led by Mandela, won an overwhelming majority, reflecting the hopes and aspirations of millions of South Africans for a new beginning. Mandela's inauguration on May 10, 1994, was a moment of profound significance. The ceremony, held in Pretoria, was attended by dignitaries from around the world, symbolizing the global recognition of South Africa's transition from apartheid to democracy. In his inaugural speech, Mandela spoke of the triumph of freedom over oppression and emphasized the need for unity, reconciliation, and nation-building. His words, filled with hope and resolve, set the tone for his presidency and the path South Africa would take. As president, Mandela faced immense challenges. The legacy of apartheid had left South Africa deeply divided, with entrenched racial inequalities, widespread poverty, and high levels of unemployment. The country was also grappling with social tensions and a fragile economy. Mandela understood that addressing these issues required visionary leadership and inclusive governance. One of his primary goals was to dismantle the structures of apartheid and establish a foundation for a non-racial, democratic society. Mandela oversaw the drafting and adoption of a new constitution, which became one of the most progressive in the world. The constitution enshrined fundamental rights and freedoms for all citizens, regardless of race, gender, or background, and laid the groundwork for a more equitable society. Mandela also prioritized reconciliation and healing, recognizing that building a united nation required addressing the wounds of the past. He supported the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, to provide a platform for victims and perpetrators of apartheid-era crimes to share their stories. The TRC aimed to uncover the truth, promote understanding, and foster forgiveness, helping South Africa to move forward without forgetting its history. Economically, Mandela sought to balance the urgent need for social justice with the practicalities of fostering growth and stability. His government introduced policies aimed at redistributing resources and improving access to education, healthcare, and housing for marginalized communities. At the same time, Mandela reassured investors and promoted foreign relations to attract the support needed to rebuild South Africa. Mandela's presidency was not without criticism, but his leadership style, marked by humility, empathy, and a willingness to listen, earned him respect from both allies and opponents. He served as a unifying figure in a country that had been fractured for decades, proving that it was possible to overcome hatred and build a future rooted in hope and shared purpose. Through his presidency, Mandela not only transformed South Africa, but also inspired the world with a model of leadership based on forgiveness, inclusivity, and a commitment to justice. Throughout his life, Nelson Mandela was a staunch advocate for equality, dedicating himself to dismantling the entrenched systems of racial, social, and economic inequality in South Africa. His presidency and the policies he pursued reflected his unwavering belief in the fundamental principle that all people are equal and deserving of dignity, rights, and opportunities, regardless of their background. The foundation of Mandela's commitment to equality was laid during his early years of activism in the African National Congress, ANC, where he worked to challenge the apartheid government's discriminatory laws. Under apartheid, Black South Africans were systematically denied access to quality education, healthcare, housing, and political participation. Mandela recognized that the fight for equality was not just about eliminating legal segregation, but also about addressing the deep economic and social disparities that apartheid had created. As president, Mandela prioritized initiatives aimed at creating a more inclusive and equitable society. He implemented policies to ensure greater access to education for all South Africans, particularly in underprivileged communities that had been neglected for decades. Recognizing that education was a powerful tool for empowerment, Mandela championed the expansion of school infrastructure, teacher training programs, and scholarships to bridge the gap between privileged and disadvantaged students. Healthcare was another critical area of focus for Mandela's administration. South Africa faced significant public health challenges, including the legacy of apartheid-era disparities in medical services and the growing HIV/AIDS epidemic. Mandela worked to improve access to health care for marginalized communities by increasing funding for clinics and hospitals, training more healthcare professionals, and advocating for public awareness campaigns. His commitment to improving healthcare laid the groundwork for long-term efforts to reduce inequality in this sector. Economic inequality one of the most enduring legacies of apartheid, was a central concern for Mandela. While his government faced constraints in implementing large-scale redistribution due to the fragile economic climate, Mandela sought to address systemic disparities through land reform programs, labor protections, and affirmative action policies. The Reconstruction and Development Program, RDP, was introduced to address housing shortages, provide basic services such as clean water and electricity, and create jobs for historically disadvantaged communities. Mandela also worked to promote equality through symbolic acts that carried powerful messages of inclusion and unity. One of the most iconic examples was his embrace of the predominantly white Springboks rugby team during the 1995 Rugby World Cup, hosted by South Africa. Mandela's decision to wear the team's jersey, a symbol of Afrikaner pride, while presenting the trophy demonstrated his commitment to bridging divides and uniting the nation. His gesture was a profound statement that equality and reconciliation were not just political goals, but a way of fostering mutual respect and understanding. Mandela's efforts to promote equality extended beyond South Africa's borders. He became a vocal advocate for global human rights, speaking out against oppression and inequality wherever they existed. His work as a mediator in international conflicts and his support for marginalized communities worldwide reflected his belief that equality was a universal value. Mandela's legacy as a champion of equality continues to inspire movements for justice and fairness across the globe. Nelson Mandela's influence extended far beyond the borders of South Africa, making him a global icon for justice, peace, and human rights. After his release from prison in 1990, Mandela emerged as not only a leader of South Africa's liberation movement, but also as a symbol of hope for oppressed people worldwide. His life and work became a testament to the power of resilience, forgiveness, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. One of Mandela's most significant contributions to the global community was his role in advocating for human rights and democracy. He used his position as president and his international platform to call attention to injustices in other parts of the world. Mandela frequently spoke out against authoritarian regimes, human rights violations, and the marginalization of vulnerable populations. His voice carried immense moral authority, and his calls for change often inspired international action. Mandela's commitment to peace was evident in his efforts to mediate conflicts and foster reconciliation in other countries. He played a key role in encouraging dialogue and negotiation during the Burundi Civil War in the late 1990s, working tirelessly to help opposing factions reach a peace agreement. His involvement demonstrated his belief in the power of dialogue and compromise to resolve even the most entrenched disputes. In addition to promoting peace, Mandela was a staunch advocate for global equality and solidarity. He used his influence to challenge the economic disparities between developed and developing nations, urging wealthy countries to support economic growth and social development in poorer regions. Mandela also championed debt relief for African nations, arguing that excessive debt hindered their ability to invest in healthcare, education, and infrastructure. His advocacy for global economic justice resonated with leaders and activists worldwide. Mandela's international advocacy extended to the fight against HIV/AIDS, an issue that deeply affected South Africa and other nations. In the late 1990s, Mandela began speaking openly about the epidemic, breaking the stigma and denial that surrounded it. After stepping down from the presidency, he intensified his efforts, launching the Nelson Mandela Foundation to focus on health and education initiatives, including HIV/AIDS awareness and prevention. Mandela's willingness to address the issue head-on, even revealing that his own son had died of AIDS-related complications, helped to destigmatize the disease and mobilize global action. Education was another area where Mandela made a global impact. He believed that education was the most powerful tool to change the world, a message he carried to international forums and organizations. Mandela worked to improve access to education not only in South Africa, but also in other countries facing similar challenges. His efforts inspired initiatives aimed at eradicating illiteracy, expanding educational opportunities for girls, and improving the quality of education in underserved regions. Mandela's legacy as a global advocate also includes his work in promoting environmental sustainability. He emphasized the need for countries to work together to address climate change and protect the planet for future generations. Although these issues were not the central focus of his presidency, Mandela recognized their importance and spoke about the interconnectedness of justice, equality, and environmental stewardship. Through his speeches, actions, and enduring presence on the world stage, Mandela became a unifying figure who transcended political and cultural boundaries. His ability to inspire people of all nations, races, and religions to work toward a common vision of peace and equality cemented his status as one of the most influential leaders in history. Mandela's global influence continues to shape movements for justice and inspire leaders committed to creating a more equitable and sustainable world. Nelson Mandela's leadership remains one of the most enduring aspects of his legacy, celebrated for its wisdom, humility, and transformative impact. Mandela's approach to leadership was grounded in his unwavering commitment to justice, equality, and the greater good. Over the course of his life, he demonstrated a profound ability to inspire, unite, and guide people through some of the most challenging periods in history, leaving an indelible mark on South Africa and the world. Mandela's leadership style was shaped by his personal experiences of adversity, including his 27 years of imprisonment. During this time, he refined his ability to listen, reflect, and strategize. His patience and long-term vision allowed him to remain focused on the ultimate goal of a free and equal South Africa, even when immediate circumstances seemed bleak. Mandela's ability to balance pragmatism with principle became a hallmark of his leadership, earning him the respect of both allies and adversaries. One of Mandela's greatest strengths as a leader was his capacity to inspire hope and resilience in others. Even in the darkest days of apartheid, he conveyed a sense of optimism and determination that galvanized the anti-apartheid movement. His speeches, writings, and personal interactions reflected his belief that change was possible through collective action and perseverance. Mandela's leadership extended beyond rhetoric. He led by example, demonstrating courage, integrity, and a willingness to sacrifice for the cause of justice. Mandela's presidency was a masterclass in inclusive and empathetic leadership. After being elected as South Africa's first black president in 1994, he prioritized national unity and reconciliation. Recognizing the deep scars left by decades of apartheid, Mandela reached out to all communities, including those who had supported the oppressive regime. His symbolic gestures, such as wearing the Springbok rugby jersey during the 1995 Rugby World Cup, sent powerful messages of forgiveness and solidarity. These actions helped to heal divisions and foster a sense of shared national identity. A cornerstone of Mandela's leadership was his ability to build consensus and bring diverse groups together. During the transition to democracy, he worked tirelessly to ensure that all voices were heard, from political parties and civil society groups to business leaders and traditional authorities. Mandela's inclusive approach helped to create a foundation for a stable and democratic South Africa, avoiding the widespread violence and retribution that many had feared. Mandela was also deeply committed to the principles of accountability and servant leadership. Unlike many leaders who cling to power, he chose to serve only one term as president, stepping down in 1999. This decision underscored his belief that leadership was about service rather than personal ambition. By voluntarily relinquishing power, Mandela set a precedent for democratic governance and demonstrated that true leadership is about empowering others to carry the vision forward. Internationally, Mandela's leadership earned him widespread admiration and respect. He became a sought-after mediator in global conflicts, using his moral authority to advocate for peace and justice. His work in Burundi, where he facilitated negotiations during the Civil War, is one example of his ability to bring opposing sides together through dialogue and trust building. Mandela's approach to leadership emphasized the importance of empathy, humility, and collaboration, principles that resonate in conflict resolution efforts worldwide. Mandela's leadership was not without its challenges and criticisms. Balancing the competing demands of reconciliation and justice, economic growth and redistribution, and unity and diversity required difficult compromises. However, Mandela's ability to navigate these complexities with grace and wisdom highlighted his extraordinary capacity as a leader. He remained steadfast in his vision while adapting to changing circumstances, demonstrating that leadership is not about rigid ideology, but about serving the needs of the people. The legacy of Mandela's leadership continues to inspire leaders across the globe. His emphasis on reconciliation, inclusivity, and the power of collective action serves as a model for addressing social, political, and economic challenges in diverse contexts. Mandela's life and leadership remind us that true greatness lies in the ability to uplift others, foster unity, and work tirelessly for the betterment of humanity. Nelson Mandela was born on July 18, 1918, in the small village of Mvizo in the Eastern Cape province of South Africa, into the Thembu royal family. His birth name was Relentless, which translates to pulling the branch of a tree, or more commonly, troublemaker. His early life was shaped by the traditional African values of his family and community. His father, Gadla Henry Mfakani-Iswa, was a local chief, and Mandela's early upbringing exposed him to the complexities of leadership, governance, and the importance of tradition within his tribe. However, his father was dispossessed of his land and title by the colonial government, which sparked Mandela's early awareness of the injustice and oppression faced by Black South Africans under colonial rule. Mandela's childhood was marked by both hardship and opportunity. After his father's death when Mandela was only 9 years old, he was sent to live with the family of Chief Janjantaba Dalindibo, the regent of the Thembu people, who became his guardian. Chief Dalindibo's household provided young Mandela with more formal education and introduced him to a broader worldview. It was within this environment that Mandela's path toward leadership was first nurtured. His foster father encouraged him to pursue an education and helped him enroll in a mission school, where he began to excel academically. Mandela's education continued at Heldtown, a Methodist secondary school, where he became increasingly aware of the racial disparities in South Africa. As a young man, he saw the inequities between the education offered to Black and white South Africans, and this sparked his lifelong commitment to fighting for equal rights. In 1939, Mandela enrolled at the University of Fort Hare, one of the few institutions of higher learning available to Black students at the time. It was at Fort Hare that he became involved in student leadership, organizing a boycott in protest of the university's administration. This activism foreshadowed his future role as a leader in the broader struggle against apartheid. After his expulsion from Fort Hare for participating in the protest, Mandela moved to Johannesburg, where he completed his studies through correspondence courses at the University of South Africa. It was in Johannesburg that he began to develop his understanding of political and social movements, joining the African National Congress, ANC, and immersing himself in the struggle against racial discrimination. His early life and education were instrumental in shaping Mandela's character, values, and understanding of the need for social change. These formative experiences laid the groundwork for his future as one of the most influential leaders in the fight for justice and equality. Anti-apartheid activism. Nelson Mandela's anti-apartheid activism began in earnest during his time in Johannesburg in the early 1940s. The apartheid system, formally implemented in 1948 by the National Party government, codified racial segregation in nearly every aspect of life, from education and healthcare to employment and land ownership. South Africa's Black population faced systemic oppression, disenfranchisement, and brutal treatment, and Mandela's response to these conditions was one of active resistance. In 1944, Mandela joined the African National Congress, ANC, and co-founded the ANC Youth League with Oliver Tambo and Walter Sisulu. The Youth League aimed to inject new energy into the ANC by advocating for a more direct approach to resistance, including civil disobedience and mass mobilization. Mandela quickly became one of the League's most prominent voices, advocating for the radical change necessary to dismantle apartheid. He became deeply involved in the Defiance Campaign of 1949, a nationwide movement aimed at challenging apartheid laws through nonviolent civil disobedience. The campaign called for South Africans to refuse to comply with laws such as curfews, pass laws, and segregation in public places. Mandela was arrested several times during these protests, but the movement gained significant attention and laid the foundation for further resistance. As Mandela's role in the ANC grew, he became more critical of the organization's moderate approach. In 1952, he became the national volunteer-in-chief of the ANC's Defiance Campaign, which called for a more aggressive confrontation with the apartheid regime. This campaign, alongside his tireless organizing, helped raise awareness both in South Africa and internationally about the apartheid system's brutal realities. During this time, Mandela also worked as a lawyer, opening the first black law firm in South Africa with Oliver Tambo, where they provided legal services to those who could not afford to pay. Mandela's activism grew more focused and radical as he became disillusioned with the government's response to peaceful protests. By the early 1960s, he had become a leader within the ANC and was instrumental in founding Umkhonto we Sizwe MK. The armed wing of the ANC, MK adopted more militant tactics, including sabotage against government installations, and marked a shift from nonviolence to armed resistance in the anti-apartheid struggle. This decision reflected Mandela's belief that, while nonviolent resistance had been crucial in raising awareness, the ANC needed to engage in direct action to confront the government's violence and oppression. Mandela's leadership within the anti-apartheid movement saw him become one of the most recognizable figures in South Africa's fight for freedom. His commitment to equality, justice, and human rights inspired countless individuals within South Africa and around the world to join the struggle against apartheid. Despite repeated arrests, bans, and surveillance by the apartheid government, Mandela's resolve never wavered, and his activism laid the foundation for the eventual collapse of apartheid. Nelson Mandela's arrest in 1962 and his subsequent imprisonment marked a pivotal moment in his life and in the history of South Africa's struggle against apartheid. After spending years organizing and leading protests against the apartheid government, Mandela was arrested and charged with sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the government. His trial, known as the Rivonia Trial, was one of the most significant events of the anti-apartheid movement. At the trial, Mandela, along with several of his comrades, was charged with participating in a campaign of sabotage aimed at dismantling apartheid. During the trial, Mandela delivered his famous speech, in which he declared that he was prepared to die for the ideal of a democratic, non-racial South Africa. The speech captured the essence of his commitment to the struggle for freedom and justice. Despite facing the death penalty, Mandela was sentenced to life in prison, and he was sent to Robben Island, a notorious maximum security prison off the coast of Cape Town. Mandela's time in prison was marked by hardship and deprivation. He was subjected to grueling forced labor, living in a small, damp cell with minimal food and restricted contact with the outside world. Despite the harsh conditions, Mandela's resilience remained unbroken. He used his time in prison to continue his education, studying law and philosophy, and fostering solidarity among fellow prisoners. He became a leader not only within the ANC, but also among the prisoners, organizing discussions and debates on topics ranging from strategy to the future of South Africa. Mandela's imprisonment also elevated his status as a global symbol of resistance to apartheid. His imprisonment became a focal point for anti-apartheid campaigns worldwide, with millions of people calling for his release. International sanctions against South Africa, coupled with domestic resistance, eventually put immense pressure on the apartheid government. Mandela, despite being physically confined, continued to lead and inspire the anti-apartheid movement, signaling the power of nonviolent resistance and the global solidarity needed to end racial injustice. Mandela's time in prison was not only a test of his personal strength, but also a critical phase in the fight for South Africa's freedom. His steadfast refusal to compromise on his principles, despite offers of release in exchange for renouncing violence, demonstrated his unwavering commitment to the cause. Mandela's imprisonment became a symbol of the struggle for justice, and his eventual release would mark a pivotal moment in the final phase of the fight against apartheid. Release and reconciliation. Nelson Mandela's release from prison in 1990 was a historic moment that signified the beginning of the end of apartheid in South Africa. After spending 27 years in prison, Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison on February 11, 1990, a free man, but with a mission that was far from complete. His release followed years of negotiations between the South African government and the African National Congress, ANC, and it was clear that apartheid was beginning to crumble under the weight of both internal resistance and international pressure. Mandela's release marked the beginning of a new chapter for South Africa, one that would require extraordinary leadership and vision to guide the country through its transition from an apartheid state to a democratic, non-racial society. Mandela's approach to this new phase of struggle was grounded in his belief that reconciliation and nation-building would be essential for healing the wounds caused by decades of racial injustice. Despite the decades of personal suffering, Mandela prioritized unity over revenge, making it clear that the future of South Africa lay in cooperation and dialogue rather than retribution. Mandela's commitment to reconciliation was evident in his outreach to former enemies and his willingness to engage in dialogue with the apartheid government. He sought to convince both black and white South Africans that the future of the nation would depend on mutual respect and shared goals. His famous appeal for unity at his release speech resonated deeply with all South Africans, and his leadership style set the tone for the country's transition to democracy. A critical part of Mandela's strategy for national reconciliation was the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, in 1995. Led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the TRC aimed to uncover the truth about the atrocities committed during apartheid and to provide a forum for victims and perpetrators of violence to share their stories. The TRC became an essential mechanism for addressing the country's painful past and was central to Mandela's vision of forgiveness, healing, and rebuilding a divided nation. Mandela's ability to promote reconciliation also extended to the global stage. His release and subsequent calls for peace were heard around the world, drawing widespread support for the dismantling of apartheid. The international community, long engaged in boycotts and sanctions against South Africa, rallied behind Mandela's call for a peaceful transition, offering both moral and material support for the ANC's struggle. Mandela's leadership in the face of oppression and his emphasis on forgiveness became a powerful symbol for peace and reconciliation worldwide. Mandela's release from prison set in motion the processes that would ultimately lead to the peaceful dismantling of apartheid and the creation of a democratic South Africa, an achievement made possible by his leadership, vision, and commitment to reconciliation. His ability to forgive, to rise above past injustices, and to envision a future of unity for all South Africans remains one of his greatest legacies.